All right. I'm gonna try to look for a pen because I was like flowing with a pencil last round, which sucked.
You went real old school from flowing with a pencil. That's like,
It's gonna be an overview, then disadvantages.
Mic off.
Can I get a thumbs up from everyone? I'm ready to go. All right, wonderful. All right. 3, 2, 1. Overview. Bowser 20 finds that 95% of the urban growth will be in the developing world. This is crucial, as to evaluate sustainable development, we must prioritize the developing world first. With that, the new urban agenda should be a sustainable development priority. Advantage 1 is the internet. Hold on, my document just crashed. It's like not letting me scroll. Can I just restart? Because like I literally can't read.
Go ahead. That's
Yeah, my bad.
reading is pretty important.
Yeah, reading would be very important, especially for this.
Yeah, so you all good?
Make this
Yeah.
all up top of your head. No sources.
I mean, that would be impressive. I don't think I could do that. Here, let me
Wouldn't
try
be
to
my
just,
definition of a great debate either, but that's a whole nother question. But
here, I'm
but-
using Google Docs. I'm just gonna download it, see if that works.
okay. Well, it's better that it happened at the beginning and not like toward the middle of the speech. So
Yeah, exactly. All right, cool. I just got it downloaded. All right. Okay. All right. Restart. I'm just gonna start with the first advantage. We all got the overview, I'm assuming. Cool. All right. Advantage 1 is the internet. Prior to urbanization, Africa drastically lacked internet access. Manon 21 notes that in the 2000s, the availability of the internet in Africa remained severely underserved. At that time, the entire continent of Africa had less international internet bandwidth than the small nation of Luxembourg. Nagari 21 warrants this, as Africa's low population density in rural areas means that it's not efficient to lay fiber cables or to build cell towers in a manner that would connect every inch of the continent. Thus, Woodcare 16 explains that it is more efficient for companies to install communication lines in area with high population density. Thankfully, Bowser 20 furthers that the new urban agenda calls for universal and affordable access to the internet. This is done through the increase of urbanization, as Craig 14 confirms that for each 1% increase in urbanization, the number of internet connections rises by 3%. Thus, in the last 20 years, Varela 20 writes that internet usage in West Africa grew at high rates. In Tongo, the growth rate reached 912%, representing the country with the highest increase. This is why Mitchell 21 explains that since the year 2000, the number of people in the whole of Africa with internet access has jumped to more than 520 million. Internet access is crucial in 2 key ways. First is health. Manika 13 finds that the internet can improve the efficiency of health, reducing the cost of treating chronic diseases by 20%, address 80% of the health issues of patients, increase 40% in the number of people coming in for free HIV/AIDS screening, and raise compliance rates to 90%. Overall, Meta 19 finds that telemedicine can reduce the global health disparities, saving the lives of millions of patients in the developing world. Second is through reducing poverty. Deloitte 14 explains that a 10% increase in broadband penetration increases per capita GDP growth by 1.3%. Internet access could increase per capita incomes by 29%. Increasing internet access to levels experienced in developed countries can increase the GDP in Africa to grow by 92%. This is happening right now, as the World Bank 20 finds that data from Nigeria shows that broadband coverage moved 2.5 million people out of extreme poverty. Even better, Consultancy 16 finds that internet inclusion can lift 500 million people out of poverty by bringing transformation of services as well as boosting economic activity across the board. Advantage 2 is climate change. Currently, climate change is coming and adaptation is key, as Hakla 19 finds that by 2050, temperatures increases across Africa are projected to be 2 degrees higher. Even if emissions cease today, warming is inevitable. Adaptation is the only effective option to manage the inevitable impacts of climate change. Thankfully, the new urban agenda solves through investment into clean energy. As Bowser 20 explains, the new urban agenda ensures environmental sustainability by promoting clean energy. This happens through investment. As slide 15 explains that huge investments are pouring into cities in Africa. The recent Sustainable Development Goals include making cities resilient and with a focus on decreasing the impact of disasters and reduction in the adverse per capita environmental impact of cities. Because of this, IRNE 20 finds that between 2000 and 2017, total investment to developing countries for clean and renewable energy has reached a sum of $140 billion. This investment directly correlates to solving for climate change, leading to green tech. Bailey 2018 finds that richer is more climate friendly, especially for developing countries. Greater wealth also means higher agricultural productivity, freeing up lands for forests to grow, as well as speedier progress toward developing and deploying cheaper non-renewable fuel energy technologies. These trends can act as synergistically to ameliorate man-made climate change. Advantage 3 is food. Subsistence farming is a practice where people produce to eat, not to sell, generating no net profit with minimal economic interaction with others. This characterized most farmers pre-urbanization, and even today. Savage 19 finds that roughly 65% of Africa's population relies on subsistence farming. Affirming changes this. The New Urban Agenda expands populations and creates demand for rural agriculture, as De Bruin 20 explains. The New Urban Agenda specifically stresses the importance of rural to urban connectivity to improve food security. Linkages between rural and urban areas is especially important in light of the growing debate regarding the national food self-sufficiency. He later furthers that urbanization may stimulate productivity due to rising and changing demand depending on the proximity of urban sectors and the connectivity of rural and urban regions. By increasing demand and improving economic linkages, Nagami 17 furthers that urbanization can be a major force to fuel inclusive rural transformation and help move millions out of poverty and extreme hunger. The expanding population provides opportunities for rural farmers to increase productivity to meet the growing demand by growing new crops or creatively marketing old crops. Urban food demand can indeed spark rural renewal. These smaller cities can serve as hubs for thriving agricultural service sector, which can drive broad-based economic growth in rural areas, making agriculture economic growth more inclusive, improving infrastructure, and transforming rural areas by increasing access to cities can eradicate hunger and shift millions of people who live in remote areas away from poverty. In doing so, we can fulfill the 2030 Sustainable Development Goal agenda. Moreover, the New Urban Agenda advocates for green belts, which are planning policies that seek to retain a ring of agriculture forest or other land around a growing settlement by refusing to allow development there, dedicating certain parts of cities to require agricultural land. Because of this, since the 80s, total food production has tripled, outpacing population growth, and per capita food production has increased by more than 40%. With this increase in food productions, since the 90s, undernourishment has decreased by 60% in Sahel and West Africa. Food security is widely important, as more than 2/3 of Africans depend on agriculture for their incomes. For instance, over the last decade, 1 million people in Rwanda have lifted themselves out of extreme poverty, capitalizing on rapidly improving agricultural sector.
Okay. Just give me a thumbs up whenever you're ready for cross-X. Okay, let's just start at the bottom and then work our way back up to the top.
Cool.
So under this food and farming contention, a lot of your research relies on Africa specifically. So what does what is just the connection besides the green belts that New Urban Agenda will play globally in changing this system and benefiting farmers?
So 2 things. First, the green belts that you talk about, but secondly, building infrastructure and creating more connectivity between urban and rural areas, which currently does not exist.
Okay, cool. And then you also talked a lot about how food production has skyrocketed. Was that statistic for global research, or was that for specifically?
No, that's Africa. Yeah, that's it's actually specific to West Africa.
Okay.
But yeah.
And so that is based on the structure of subsistence agriculture and not from factory farms or anything like that?
There's not factory farms in the developing world, so I'm gonna go and say yeah, it's from subsistence farming.
Okay. Now let's go to climate. So this development in green tech, or these investments in green tech in developing countries, what have those looked like specifically in terms of what the kinds of technology?
Solar panels, wind power.
Okay.
Mostly wind, actually. I think the number, because they can build them in the desert. Yeah, it's easier for them to build there.
And so you talk a lot about that was in the span of from 2000 to 2017. Have we seen any mitigation of climate change in that time span?
Not globally, but we would argue that the developing world probably needs it best because they contribute a large amount to it within coal producing power plants. So making a switch is just on net a benefit.
Okay, so the developing world contributes a lot to climate change.
Yeah,
Okay,
most cities do too. Yeah, like a lot of things do.
yeah. Okay, now let's go back to the internet. So how many people in the world, like on average, don't like at a rough estimate, like don't have access to the internet right now?
I think the number is anywhere between 1 to 2 billion.
Okay, and how many of those people live in cities?
I would say a pretty decent amount. If you're an African and you're living in a slum, you probably don't have access to the Wi-Fi.
Like, do you have any numbers or anything, or is that just a guess?
Well, we can tell you that internet access has increased because of investment and infrastructure through the
Right.
new urban agenda and stuff like
But
that.
just how many people in cities don't have access to the internet?
Here, let me see. Well, we can tell you like just like the empiric of like in the early 2000s, like literally like the nation of Luxembourg, like this super small country, had more internet access than the entire continent of Africa. So we
Right.
can see that
But
there's
that
like
was
a
a couple
massive
decades-
increase.
That was right, but that was also a couple decades ago. And also, I feel like there's a big distinction between people who either by choice don't utilize the internet, people who live in rural areas, and then people who live in cities that just don't have internet access.
Either way, the new urban agenda probably makes it better, which is what
Okay.
our argument is going to be.
Okay. And so just like a lot of this focuses on Africa specifically. So just like what are the implications for the rest of the world? Like what's the applicability of all this research to like other parts of the world, South and Central America, Asia, North America, Europe?
Yeah. Okay. Well, like countries in Asia and South America are also considered a part of the developing world, so our overview still applies. But secondly, we're not really constraining the round to like necessarily the developing world. I just argue that
Right.
since the majority of like 95% of all development is occurring in the developing world, it's like why would we focus on the rest of the 5% if it doesn't matter as much?
Okay, cool. That's time.
Y'all ready?
Oh,
It is gone.
perfect. We love that. Okay, so this is just going to be case. Is anyone not ready? Okay, perfect. At this time, the NEG offers the following definition of sustainable development as adopted by the United Nations as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Furthermore, the distinction between sustainable and sustainable development is pertinent to today's round. The NEG contends that sustainability refers to a long-term goal, while sustainable development refers to the many processes to achieve it. This means that the act must consider the means, not just the ends. Contention 1, the NUA is inherently flawed. Subpoint A, old methods have been proven to be ineffective. While the new urban agenda does seem to broaden the conceptual framework in what cities are and what sustainability can mean in this context, when it comes to the how, the NUA reverts to the same policy and methodological framework of the past. Thus, criticisms abound. It is marked by increasing worry that the NUA is inherently flawed and therefore its end goal is highly improbable. CACIC 17 finds that the NUA's bold claim of a paradigm shift is unrealistic, given that the suggested pathways and implementation is based on old methodological tools that did not work. The The NUA is based on a techno-managerial approaches and modernization paradigms, such as smart cities or indicator-based management, which, while they've been around for a long time, have been proven to be ineffective in shifting urban development onto a more sustainable pathway, especially in the developing world. The underlying flaw of the old methodology in the NUA is simple. Smart cities do not equal sustainable cities. CACIC furthers that smart cities and ITCs cannot be the solution here because they are in fact part of the problem. Consequently, the NUA lacks a transformative vision of future political economy that would be able to address root causes of inequality and urban non-sustainability. As such, CACIC labels the NUA at its best as a kind of immunology. It vaccinates its citizens and environments so they can take larger doses of inequality and degradation in the future rather than alleviating it directly. However, at its worst, the NUA methodological flaw leads to greater inequality, poor working conditions, and a perpetuation of traditional oppressive systems. Subpoint 2, vagueness mitigates effectiveness. The NUA's fuzziness presents a challenge for its potential to guide action. In particular, the NUA has a problem that it calls for too much at the same time, overburdening any realistic agenda for policymakers. David Satterwhite of the International Institute for Environment and Development reflects that it falls short of setting priorities and hierarchies and presenting clear guidance on policy trajectories that need to be followed to achieve its ambitious goals. For instance, Bunabach and Mitlin find that there is little acknowledgement of the central role of urban governments in almost all aspects of the NUA. Mayors aren't mentioned once. Democracy is not mentioned. Innovations such as the Slum Shack Dwellers Federation and their partnerships with local governments are ignored. Concepts that do get mentioned, such as sustainability, manage to be both vague and repetitious. The word sustainable appears 136 times in the 23-page document with many different meanings. Sustainable is applied to physical and social infrastructure, cities, construction modes, consumption and production patterns, culture, debt management, economic development, economic growth, and education. The NUA's lack of concrete implementation policies and measures mitigate its ability to be effective. Contention 2, the implementation process of the NUA is not feasible. Subpoint A, incompatibility with private sector priorities. The NUA acknowledges that implementation and financing urban sustainability will need strong commitments from the private sector. This pushes in line with a wider shift in how the roles and responsibilities for actions are seen within the post-2015 development agenda. The UN's Global Compact program, for example, stresses the need for finance actions and action alliances between government and private sector. Fisherman, Dockman 17, and Satterwhite 17 both find that due to this financial structure, the prospects for achieving the framed sustainability goals will be minimal in developing countries as long as the wider architecture for financing remains unchanged. Furthermore, private sector organizations play a role in exacerbating actual existing urban problems. Horn and Nolan find that in each wave of urban rhetoric, outfitted with terms such as smart, sustainable, and resilient, offers actual underlying opportunities for the reordering of relations in favor of capital accumulation with potentially exacerbating consequences for climate change, inequality, and/or inclusive governance. As many scholars have shown, whether in climate change or resilience or smart cities, the dominant theme of the private sector is an active intermediary in the realignment of corporate and urban governance interests. The impact of the NUA are twofold. First, reliance on the plan that heavily relies on private sector financing operates on a flawed financial structure that at best will achieve minimal impacts in developing countries. Second, private sector reliance will likely exacerbate inequality. Subpoint B, lack of guidance for local government. While so-called implementation plan occupies the longest chapter of the NUA, it provides surprisingly little insight into the concrete implementation policies and measures. Satterwhite contends that the NUA is neither new nor really an agenda. For example, while there are many commitments to helping or strengthening the national government, we commit appears 48 times, there's little attention to how this would actually occur. Little better can be said in regards to subnational and local governments. When they get mentioned a lot, subnational 54 times and local government 39 times, they can only take on subsidiary roles in implementing the NUA. Furthermore, the NUA claims that it contributes to the implementation of sustainable development goals in an integrated manner, but Satterwhite finds that many of the commitments in the NUA are the same as the SDGs, although this is not acknowledged. The NUA wants their own document with their own commitments, almost as if they saw SDGs as a competitor. Not only does this agenda lay out astronomical goals and expect governments to achieve them without a playbook, the NUA goals or similarities to the SDGs result in unnecessary redundancy. Subpoint C, the NUA harms civil society. There's ample evidence that green development agendas have been driving a new form of displacement and environmental gentrification. Case in point is India. CACIC finds that the Prime Minister Modi's program promoting smart cities as a growth engine had highly questionable socio-environmental outcomes, beginning with a form of entrepreneurial urbanization that failed to develop an integrated set of alternative policies that would address, amongst other things, issues related to the country's colonial past. CACIC finds that while Vested in a rhetoric of enabling radical change, such solutions contribute to assure that nothing really changes. Thus, the NUA exacerbates oppressive systems and colonial past. While there may be public support for the lofty goals this proposes, history justifies the public's extreme distrust over the implementation of the NUA. Because of the flaws in the document itself and the implementation process, we urge a neg ballot.
Okay. I'll give it a timer. 1 sec. Cool. Okay, why is the new urban agenda ineffective?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Why is the new urban agenda ineffective?
Well, kind of going back to our case, like we break it down into two main things. Like the text of the plan itself sets it up to be ineffective. And then secondly, its implementation is extremely ineffective. So going back to the text of the plan, like it's extremely vague. Like it doesn't give governments a playbook for like how they should be implementing it. Basically, it's like a list of lofty goals.
So do you agree that like different cities, like they're built differently and they're structured differently? So there can't be like a one size fit all?
Exactly. There shouldn't be like a one size fits all. Like here is like you're going to do it every
That's
step.
not what the new urban agenda advocates for.
No, but they do need some kind of guidance. Sure, you want to achieve equality. That's a great goal, but you need to have like some idea of how you're going to do it. So while I'm not saying like that you need like a step by step, like here's how we're going to do it in every case, you do need some kind of like broader framework of here's what we're going to do to achieve those things. And the biggest criticism of the new urban agenda is that it doesn't provide cities with that. It provides them with this lofty list of like long goals, like solving poverty, solving mental health, solving for climate change, solving all of these things, but it doesn't give cities at any level like steps to achieve those things. Furthermore, it actually like kind of duplicates like sustainable development goals, which makes it like extremely redundant.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's go and talk about like your civil society and environmental like or the environment, like building green technology like is displacing people, right?
Okay.
Is that happening right now?
Yes. So
how many people? Okay, so how many people have been displaced?
So we give you the example of like India, right? And the program that they tried to run there. Like I don't have like a specific like number for you. I can find it later.
So what happened in India then?
So like in India, they tried this like a smart city structure. And
so it's smart city, it's not green technology.
No, sorry, the India example is like a smart city example.
Okay, but those are two different things now.
Well, I mean, I would argue not really, because smart cities use green technologies to become smart cities.
Yeah.
Like,
okay. Yeah. Like there's certain
rely
aspects,
on the
but
same...
you're okay. No. But your link was that the new urban agenda advocates for like green technology. The green technology displaces people. Now we're talking about smart cities displacing people. So like it's like they don't connect really.
Okay. Sorry, if I'll just go ahead and explain that. Okay, so like what we tell you in subpoint C when we're talking about civil society is that there's ample evidence like that green development agendas, that's the wording that we use, are what causes like displacement. Green development agendas, yes, they rely on green technology, but like they broadly include smart cities. So like I understand like you're trying to delineate the two, but like smart cities rely on green technologies to become smart cities. And the problem...
Okay, that's fair. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So like oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, you can keep explaining. Sorry. I was just like smiling. My bad.
Oh, okay. So like the example that we give you of India, they tried to do like one of these like programs, like, and just to clarify, like a green development agenda. They tried to like implement this, and it like kind of became like a form of entrepreneurial urbanization, but it failed to come up with like an integrated set of policies that would like address like their history related to the colonial past. Like if you want another example off the top of my head, I can give you an example of Masdar from Abu Dhabi. They tried a similar like green development agenda, similar to new urban agenda, and in that case we actually saw like displacement and environmental gentrification in two ways. Like first, as far as like environmental gentrification, we saw that there was an increased mining in coltan, which is like an extremely harmful mineral that led to displacement of people, as well as like environmental degradation, and like it was mined under near slave labor conditions. And
okay.
Time.
Yeah. All right. Is everyone starting with like a little weighing overview on their side of the flow. And then it's just going to be top bottom. I'll signpost though, so we're not going to get lost. All right, cool. I'm assuming everyone's ready. So, yep. All right, awesome. Start off as a weighing overview. Realize that my opponents, they don't give you one terminalized impact in today's round. With that, we're always going to be outweighing my opponent's case for a few reasons. One, we are always going to outweigh on scope because we have a terminalized impact on every single one of our arguments, meaning that you can even compare our weighing to theirs because they don't even give you one terminalized thing. It's literally going to be impossible to actually weigh any of the arguments in this round. For that reason alone, you should already be looking at the app because if they say that a new urban agenda is so vague, their entire case is so vague because you don't actually know what you're voting on as a judge. But secondly, realize that my opponents don't give you one bit of solvency in this round. They don't give you an alternative plan of how to make any of the issues with the new urban agenda better. That's really important because that means no matter what, you're going to have to affirm because it's the only risk of offense in today's round in order for you to actually do something. Sure, they can come up here and tell you how ineffective and how vague it is. Even if that's true, it's only minimal. It's only like minimal defense at best on our arguments because we tell you and give examples of internet becoming better, food becoming better, and climate change ultimately getting better. That is on net a good reason for you to just affirm there. So with that, their entire case is already kind of in shambles. But with that, let's go to their first argument about this, like how it's like flaw right now and how smart cities are actually extremely ineffective. Well, realize that smart cities aren't ineffective. Cities such as Singapore, Dubai, I can like list there's like a laundry list of them. Let's see, Singapore, Dubai, Oslo, Copenhagen, Boston, Amsterdam, New York, these are all definitions of smart cities, and realize that none of those cities all those cities are actually doing quite good. So they can't point to you an example of why smart cities right now are magically failing. We would argue that if technology is only going to get better with the new urban agenda, investment's only going to increase, then there's no reason for why smart cities are instantly going to be bad. It creates a turn on their case. But secondly, let's go to the inequality link. We tell you that the only reason why inequality exists right now is because poverty is really high in these cities. That's what inherently inequality is. If we tell you that we solve the root cause of poverty by increasing internet access and giving people economic mobility, then that inequality is only going to shrink in the app world. That's really important because they don't even tell you how bad inequality is right now. We would argue it's not. And if people are increasingly getting lifted out of poverty right now in the status quo, we would tell you that inequality is going down and it's only going to be getting better with the new urban agenda. With that, let's go and talk about our second link about vagueness. They literally give you not one example of what's actually vague about the new urban agenda. That's really problematic because I can give you four unique examples on my case of what's actually like not vague about it. One, for example, like on the advantage of food, we tell you that right now the new urban agenda calls for better transportation infrastructure between rural and urban areas to increase demand for subsistence farming. But secondly, on green belts, we tell you that they dedicate portions of the city for agricultural land. That is super specific to cities, and it doesn't sound that vague to me. But let's go and talk about like the feasibility on it on their first argument about like these public or about the private sector and stuff like that. Realize even if the private sector is inherently bad, we all know the basics of supply and demand. When the supply of something increases, the price of it decreases. That's really important because we would tell you if it's on net, more things are being built and it's going to be cheaper for people to access it. That's on net a good thing. But secondly, the part in which when the new urban agenda actually calls for like these private partnerships that they talk about, they also mention regional banks, investment banks, and all these other things. For example, regional banks are actually really good for developing countries. Look to the ASEAN nations, the Eastern Asian nations. They have their own East Asian Development Bank, and that bank alone has lifted millions of people out of poverty, invested millions, probably close to billions of dollars in infrastructure. So we would argue that if anything is going to actually help the developing world, it's probably going to be regional banks, not these private corporations that are profiting. But thirdly, even if you buy the fact that these private corporations are really bad, realize that the new urban agenda has these small city councils in which people gather and talk with the government before they go and actually build the infrastructure through private corporation. That means that the people can actually have a voice and can voice their opinion within the new urban agenda for these private corporations. But then lastly, we would argue that the government is not going to allow all these harms that my opponents talk about, because realize that when you plan a city, the city gives certain guidelines to these private institutions. The private institutions don't just run up into a country and start building whatever they want. It doesn't work that way. No, the city has guidelines. They're forced to build things in certain areas and do it in a certain way, or else they're ultimately not going to get paid to do the job. With that pretty much takes out the entire argument of like private companies and stuff like that. Let's go and talk about civil societies. Their entire argument right here is that smart cities are like green technology is going to be displacing people. One, realize this argument's non-unique and there's no solvency for it. We tell you that green technology is already on the rise. That's really important because if green technology is already increasing, that means there's no net way to solve the people from being solve all the people from being displaced. We say that this is constantly going to happen, and the sad truth is that there's really no way to solve it. But the only way that we can actually, we probably can solve it. With the new urban agenda, we can solve it because we're going to decrease poverty and make these people just ultimately live a better life. So that acts as like a turn on the argument. But also, secondly, on their argument about like smart cities and stuff, they can't point to like any examples of like people actually like living in wrong areas. Like we tell you that like Singapore and like Dubai, like they're extremely wealthy areas and these are like smart cities, and there's not that like ultimately that many people like living in like poverty and stuff like that. So with those reasons, we must affirm.
Are you ready for a cross?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. All right. Historically, have UN conferences like resulting in non-binding commitments actually like produced change to meet these commitments?
Yeah, Habitat 1 to Habitat 2 to Habitat 3, there's been massive changes within the Sustainable Development Goals and just the writing of the new urban agenda. So I would say, yeah.
Right. There's been changes like made to like how we think about sustainability. And like you said, like we've produced more sustainability goals, but we actually seen like empirical, like measurable change like in the world?
Yeah, those are like my 3 advantages, like internet increasing and Wi-Fi, investment in green tech only increasing, and like and food security being better.
Okay, and you're tying like all of those things back to like UN like spot like Habitat 1 and Habitat 2?
No, I'm
You're
tying
saying-
it back to the new urban agenda, which is what my case is.
Okay. But is like all of your evidence is like specific to urbanization, not like the new urban agenda, right?
It's not true at all. So both of the links on the food advantage are specific to the new urban agenda. It's literally cited from the new urban agenda. The advantage on climate change, talking about increased investment and stuff like that, that's a part of the new urban agenda. And then there's also another card, which is specific to the sustainable development goals there, which also talks about that. And the thing about the advantage of Wi-Fi, the advantage of Wi-Fi talks about universal access to affordable internet access throughout like a city.
Okay, but the evidence that you bring up, like let's go to internet, for example, like the Africa
Sure.
evidence you bring up, don't you say like correct me like if I'm quoting wrong, but you say like prior to urbanization in Africa, like the lack of internet was like problematic. So like
Yeah.
this is in regards to like urbanization in like general, not necessarily like, can we agree that there are like other like means of urbanization besides just like the new urban agenda?
Yeah, I mean, like you could argue that, but then you're gonna have to like argue like a counter policy for that, and which you don't give. And we would tell you that the new urban agenda is only the risk of offense in the round to actually do it.
Okay, cool. So you talk about like in your little like overview, you say like 95% of the growth is in like the developing world. So in this round, should we be focusing like on the developing world?
Yeah.
Okay, so then like on the next side of the flow, you bring up like what you say like are smart cities like Singapore, and I'm sorry, I forget the other example. Like are
Yeah,
those
Singapore, Dubai, like Boston and stuff. No, those are just examples of like good smart cities.
okay, but those aren't in the developing world.
They were at one point in time, and then they developed.
Okay, but like currently they're not in the developing world.
No, but I mean Beijing is also like I'm pretty sure a smart city, and that's technically a developing. China's technically a developing country, so like that's a better example.
Okay, like great. But as far, like far as the evidence goes, like we brought up during like the last cross, I think we brought up like the example of like Colton and like how it's like being mined in places like the Congo, and like how like as these cities in developing worlds like today become like more urbanized under the new urban agenda, this leads to like things like slave labor conditions and such.
Yeah.
Like-
So okay. So there's okay. I see what you're saying with that. Well, one, realize that a lot of these mines, they're not happening in urban centers, right? There's not just like a mine in the middle of like New York City. Like
No, but
that's
they're
not-
happening like it's like the secondary cause of urbanization. Like as you urbanize, right? And like
Oh,
as
okay. I see what you're
smart
saying.
cities,
Yeah.
like,
Okay.
we need more technology, right? And like the
So
things the technology is made of is like minerals like coltan or like
yeah,
lithium that are mined, like as you brought
sure.
up areas, right?
Okay. Yeah. So two things. one, we would argue the new urban agenda actually what's the word? Or just like wants better workers' rights and stuff like that. And secondly, we would argue that urbanization is non-unique, so the argument still happens regardless, absent the new urban agenda or without it.
Okay, and just one last question. Is the new urban agenda binding? Is there any kind of enforceability mechanism?
There's not.
Thank you.
Mic off.
Order's gonna be the AF case and then the neg case. Is anybody not ready? Okay, so I'm just gonna be doing some analysis on each of these three affirmative advantages to just tell you why the logic behind them is flawed, but not only that, why they will actually be able, you'll actually be able to turn multiple of these impacts to better serve the negative, and prove to you why implementing the new urban agenda is going to make a lot of these impacts that they're trying to solve for worse. Let's start with the internet advantage. Not only does the link story on this not really make a ton of sense, because it's not clear how many people the new urban agenda is going to bring internet to. Also, they cannot claim solvency for these billions of people who do not have internet, when we can't even get clear statistics about how many of these people either choose to not utilize the internet, or how many of these people live in rural areas, which the new urban agenda is not designed to benefit. Along with that, they claim these impacts of increased access to health and decreased poverty from increasing access to the internet. And those simply do not make sense, because the infrastructure does not exist in many of these countries, doesn't even exist in developed countries like the United States, where they have this kind of infrastructure necessary for systems to benefit people through these social programs. A lot of these social programs have to come from the state. The United Nations New Urban Agenda cannot do anything to pass social programs to benefit people. Rather, all it does is suggest guidelines. As he just mentioned in the last cross-examination, there's no binding mechanism making anyone cooperate with the new urban agenda. It has absolutely zero guarantee of solvency, and all it's going to do is make things worse. Imagine people coming into your city in anywhere in the world and completely updating it to change your way of life and implement new technologies that you might not be interested in and might not want to have in your community. That is the kind of mindset that the United Nations is going forward with, and that is why it's going to make these countries net worse overall. Now let's go on to the climate argument. So this argument hinges on the idea that growing urbanization is good for climate change. However, that's simply not the case. Research from Cullis in 2019 talks about how not only does urbanization contribute astronomically to rising climate change threat, but also it decreases water quality, a basic human resource, and makes it net worse in the majority of these urban areas. And as the research also points out, this is traditionally in cities in the global south that do not have the conditioned infrastructure that they are trying to advantage. So not only is there no claim of solvency from building this kind of infrastructure, because there's no enforcement mechanism and there's no delineated plan of action. The United Nations passed this in 2016. This was an agreement ratified by dozens of countries in 2016, and yet we've seen no significant progress since then to actually take action on it. However, what we see is that during the time that they talk about this green investment and this green tech being put in place in developing countries, we see that climate change got exponentially worse. What we're seeing is that climate change is reaching a point of no return, and that unless there's action taken to mitigate the effects of climate change, that all we're going to see is that we cannot have this as a benefit or an advantage to the affirmative. Because not only that, anyway, the individual action and the action in the developing world is not going to be able to solve for climate change, because the wealthiest 10% of the global population is responsible for 50% of emissions. And additionally, 100 companies are responsible for 71% of global emissions since 1988. And you know what these companies are doing? They are the corporations, the multinational corporations endorsed by the United Nations to be utilized as the funding mechanism for the New Urban Agenda. The New Urban Agenda is designed to be funded through action and through agreements with corporations, and those corporations are the ones with their own interests at heart, which means that they will not be taking into account the interests of the people that they're trying to benefit in these cities, but instead they will be trying to do all that they can to continue to be allowed to pollute across the globe. These corporations are the problem, and the United Nations is just encouraging them and allowing them more opportunity to spread globally. Now let's go on to the food advantage. Urban sprawl completely kills this entire advantage. Sure, they might have the claim of or like these green beltways, but with increased food production, that's going to not only increase the amount of factory farming needed in these countries, because just because it doesn't exist now doesn't mean it's not going to exist at a certain point. And that means that there are going to be a continued increase in carbon emissions because factory farming is net worse for the environment. Also, this urban sprawl means that there's not going to be enough ground left for them to claim that they're going to have this food and this land and this clean air for this kind of farming and for this kind of sustenance. And so this culture not only is going to be completely demolished by the United Nations Urban Agenda because of their plan forward, but it's also not going to solve because it's just simply not feasible. Now let's go on to the negative case for a minute. So basically what a lot of this research is focusing on, specifically the Kakiak research, which goes in depth into why the New Urban Agenda is going to fail, is that it's not going to be possible to implement it. Not only that, it's completely vague because there's no actual policy suggestions within the document. Instead, the document just provides guidelines and suggestions and feel-good statements about why we should all develop sustainably. However, this is not what's actually going to occur in the real world. Instead, we see that there's no finance, and if there is finance, it's going to come from corporations with less than ideal interests. There's also no guidance for local government. The United Nations simply does not care about the actual implementation of this plan, and that is what Ellie told you in the first speech. All they care about is putting their good face forward and trying to benefit themselves and benefit their perception on the global stage, and this is not one of their commitments. It's harmful to civil society in addition, as Ellie brought up. We have and it's not a successful plan. There's no means of implementation. There's no kind of enforcement mechanism, and its interests are less than beneficial, and that is time. I'm open for cross-eyes.
Okay. Let's assume that you're deeply impoverished, right?
I'm a college student, so yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah, fair. So would you want to do anything to actually like get out of poverty? Like would you try your best, your hardest to get out of poverty?
I mean, I don't know if like this is a fair question. I can't really speak to the experience of people who have experienced poverty because I am lucky to have not experienced that. And so I don't know if I should like hypothesize about the lives of people who live in different countries.
Well,
but,
no,
like,
it's not about different countries. It's just like in general. Like if you would like, okay, for example, like let's say like you did not have access to water, like and you would want access to water, right? Like would you try your very best to get access to water because you needed to live?
Yeah, but the New Urban Agenda is not going to get me better water. It's going to get me worse water because of the research about urbanization making water quality worse.
Okay, yeah, like I'm gonna respond to that later. But just like it's clean water, like we're just gonna keep going around in circles. Like you would ultimately want to get access to that water.
I mean, yeah, I think that's like
Okay.
a basic function. Otherwise, I'd die.
Okay, cool. All right, let's go and talk about like these private corporations benefiting out of these countries. How are they benefiting?
Right. So the UN's funding mechanisms that's set up is that they want to have the New Urban Agenda funded by corporations. That's in the document. They have no funding mechanism because they rely on other countries. So instead they're going private with the funding in an attempt to spur innovation. But what that's actually going to do is spur the capitalist colonialist doctrine of these corporations into developing countries. Because the only reason these corporations would want to get involved is if they have a profit interest at heart. And that's what's going to happen.
All right, that's fine. So what do like these private corporations do then? Like how are they implementing this capitalistic mindset on a country?
Right. So they're the funding mechanism. So they get all the oversight. They're the people that are going to be going like
Yeah, so like where does the capitalism come into play?
Corporations like exist because of capitalism.
Having a private business is not capitalist.
Well, like the profit motive that underlies all of our society essentially is inherently our entire world is spurred and driven by capitalism. We can
So
have
your argument is just that because private corporations exist, they inherently want profit, and therefore that's capitalist.
no.
So
The
then, like,
argument is
my
mostly
question
that
is,
corporations do not have the interests of, you said earlier that we should be focusing on people in the global south or the developing world. Corporations don't really have their interests at heart. They might say
no.
they
So
do.
my argument is just that, like, what are these private corporations doing then? Because, like, you just say they have oversight. Like, oversight over
Well,
what? Like, what are
I
they
mean,
doing? Are
we
they
don't
building
really know.
infrastructure? Are they?
That's actually a good question. I would love to ask the UN because they just say that it's going to be funded through these private corporations and they don't really say what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It
So
doesn't really
section. So, like, all right, yeah. So I know exactly what you're citing from the New Urban Agenda. It's citing section 65, right? And if you like actually read like the entire sentence where it talks about private corporations, it also talks about regional development banks and like a laundry list of other finance methods. It doesn't explicitly say like private corporations are needed.
It says, let me find it.
Like, I mean, I can pull up the New Urban Agenda and like read it out. It's just like,
Designing policy considering the needs of large multinational corporations may result in large infusions of capital and investment, while consulting with small and medium-sized enterprises can lead to the cultivation of both local talent and quality employment. Blah, 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 blah. Talking about they want the capital of large multinational corporations.
where's that? Is that in the New Urban Agenda?
Yeah.
Really?
Under the economic sustainability, under principles, a sound economic development strategy includes stakeholders and policy design.
Okay.
All of that.
Well, this is time, so
Sorry.
I'll just call it that. No, you're fine. You're fine. You were reading. You didn't know. Okay. 6-minute speech, right? Okay, cool. How should I do this? Okay, it's gonna be starting on my case, and then I'll just signpost from there. It's gonna be easy, hopefully. All right, everyone good? Cool. We're winning this round on our last advantage on food. This argument is very simple and easy to understand. We tell you that right now, 65% of Africans rely on subsistence farming. Subsistence farming is the practice when people grow food only for themselves, and this primarily only happens in rural areas. We tell you that right now, the New Urban Agenda plans to create a rural renewal in which Africans living in rural areas will, one, be lifted out of poverty because of the increased demand and urban connectivity, but also we would tell you that they would be lifted out of poverty because more people are just buying food and all of Africa can actually benefit. This is a really easy argument. We tell you that right now, the New Urban Agenda specifically stresses the importance of rural to urban connectivity. This is building infrastructure from urban areas to rural areas, which increases the demand for food. And secondly, we tell you that there's these things called green belts. Green belts are essentially things that are in the New Urban Agenda that guarantee certain aspects of the city have access to food to grow for agricultural land. They give you a few responses. First, they tell you that urban sprawl is happening right now, which is going to lead to factory farming. However, this is not the case. Realize that I tell you that 65% of farmers are already subsistence farmers. There's literally going to be impossible for them to actually transition into a factory farm. But secondly, we would tell you that the majority of factory farming that occurs throughout the world is only happened in developed countries. Realize that they can see the overview on top of our case that says that we should be focused to developing countries. They cannot provide an example of factory farming happening in developing countries. So with that, yeah. Then also they say they can't grant the land because urbanization leads to like an increase of land usage, which decreases the amount of land people can farm. However, again, this is not true. Realize that we're talking about land in rural areas, not in urban areas. And because we increase the infrastructure to connect these two, it actually benefits. But secondly, even if you don't buy that response, we would tell you that there are green belts, which are specifically for urban centers. And this requires areas and urban centers to be used strictly for agricultural use. Then they try to pre-wreck our argument, saying that climate change is always going to come first. Realize that climate change is a very long-term impact. And right now, we tell you that food is the most important because it's happening right now in the short term. It's already increased. We're telling you that 500 or like a lot of people are going to get access to food, and they can't even like terminalize what's going to happen with all this like climate change stuff. With that, let's go into their case at the top. they concede the weighing overview, in which I tell you that there's no terminalization of any of their impacts, making it almost impossible to weigh any of their arguments in today's round. We tell you that we provide cities with growth and we actually increase the number of people access to food, and that's on net a good thing. Then secondly, realize that all the issues that my opponents give, they give no solvency for any of these issues. This is really important, meaning that the affirmative is the only risk of offense in today's round for you to actually vote on. So even if I gain marginal offense off any single one of my arguments, you are forced to vote for the affirmative because it's the only plan in this round that actually does something to actively help people in this round. But with that, let's go and talk about this whole idea of like these private corporations. My opponent concede 3 of my responses that I give. First, we tell you that these private corporations are increasing the supply of infrastructure and just doing things on net. Since we all know the basics of supply and demand, when the supply of something increases, we know that the price of it decreases, meaning it actually decreases inequality because if more people have access to it at a cheaper rate, that means there's less inequality in their world. But secondly, they tell you that only private multinational corporations are going to do all the investing into the New Urban Agenda. They concede the regional banks argument and the inherent empiric with the East Asian Bank, the ASEAN nations, in which they have empirically lifted thousands of people out of poverty and invested billions of dollars into these nations. And we tell you that's on it a good thing and probably a lot more accurate. And so far, that's probably happening right now. This means that these private corporations are actually not that bad. But thirdly, we tell you that right now, since the New Urban Agenda has these small group of people that meet together that are actually people that live in these cities, they talk to the government before the government goes and acts on something with these private corporations. That's really important because it gives the people the voices. If inequality was so bad with these private corporations, it's because they don't have these council meetings in which people can actively share their voice and their opinions on something. That's really important that the New Urban Agenda offers that, and they don't respond to any 3 of these responses, meaning that it's probably unlikely. Also, talk about like the city planning argument, or on the, like moreover, like we also tell you that because these public governments are required the private institutions to build something and do it in a certain way, meaning that they're forced to like build infrastructure in a better area and a area for access for everyone. That's really important because they say that private institutions only care about profit. Well, they only can get the profit if they build the infrastructure in a certain way that actually benefits the government, and the government is authorizing them to do it in the first place. So without that, the government is making the decisions first. That's like ends that. So with that, the weighing in this round is like very like easy. We tell you that like food insecurity inhibits food security like spills over and increases like economic gains and stuff like that, because the Institute of Food and Agricultural 20 finds that an increase in food security is directly associated with a wide variety of benefits in like Africa, including economic growth and job creation, poverty reduction, trade opportunities, increased global security and stability, and improved health and healthcare. That's really important because we tell you that like over 2/3 of people rely on food for their incomes, which is why in Nigeria, almost 1 million people in Rwanda were able to lift themselves out of poverty because of the better access to food security. Thus, the easiest way for you to sign this ballot is to sign for food security. We tell you it's essentially very conceded in this round, and it's really easy to respond to. But secondly, the other easier place to vote is that we are the only risk of solvency in this round to do anything to better the developing world. Is it a crossfire now, or?
No, you have
Okay, is everyone ready? Judge, are you ready? Oh, he's gone. Oh, okay, you're back. Okay, just as a brief off-time roadmap, it's just going to be like condensing all the issues down into in today's round. So it's not really going to be on one side of the floor or the other. It's going to be more on both. All right, starting off. First of all, I'd like to go back to the fact that today is like a civic debate, meaning that we're supposed to stray from like tech, which is what the app sticks to like the entire time. So like just keep this in mind, like going like to the ballot. Like today's debate is supposed to be like slow. It's supposed to be like less techy. Just keep that in mind. The first like main issue in today's round is going to be like climate, and neg is winning on climate because of the climate turn. So if you like go to the app side of the flow under climate change, they talk about like climate change here and like solvency, and like the biggest argument on neg, which goes dropped, is like that urbanization actually contributes to climate change. When we see the process of urbanization, like it makes climate change worse. It exacerbates all of the negative impacts of climate change, like rising sea levels, like poor water qualities. So if you're voting on climate change, you're voting like for the neg. Like this was turned during our rebuttal speech, and it goes dropped. Furthermore, under this, we can see that like it contributes to climate change in like more than one way. First, we talk about like urbanization on the aff side of the flow, so flow that through here. But then on the neg side of the flow, we talk about how there's how this is incompatible with the private sector. And then something that goes like dropped for the AF throughout today's round is the fact that we talk about how like the private sector realigns interests, and what that is like empirically shown to do is lead to the exacerbations of inequality that exists, such as climate change and like a lack of like good governance. So the fact that they're relying on this like finance structure, whether or not it's like 100% of the finance structure or part of it, some funding from the new urban agenda is coming from the private sector, which bakes in like to the new urban agenda the fact that it allows for like climate change and as well as like these other impacts to worsen, because historically and empirically that is what we've seen when we see private sector funding. We see that these issues and these inequalities get worse, not better. And this ties back into like the capitalist like colonialist doctrine that the neg brought up in their rebuttal speech. So if you're voting on climate, you're voting for neg because of urbanization and as well as because of like the finance structure of the new urban agenda. The second big issue in today's round is like the private sector. Let me like make a clarification here. They like in the last speech, the AF told you like the private sector is going to be like building infrastructure. That's not inherently true. Like they're not going to be built, like logically they're not going to be like the private sector is not going to be like building this infrastructure. They're going to be funding it. Second of all, like there's not total clarity on this. We don't know because the new urban agenda doesn't tell you. That in itself should be extremely problematic, that you can't at the end of the day like tell you if they are building the infrastructure or they're just funding the infrastructure. The fact that we don't know that highlights the problem of vagueness, which we bring up in our first contention subpoint B. So keep that in mind. Furthermore, let's go back to this idea of like capital accumulation, which is like how the private sector would be like funding this. That's what we bring up during like rebuttal as well as our speech, that the private sector like fosters capital accumulation, which that is like our tie back into this like capitalism like colonialist doctrine. They say there's no like link here, but like that's the link. Private sector funding is inherently like capitalistic because it encourages like this type of capital accumulation, which is like laid out in the new urban agenda, which was read during cross-acts, how this is a focus like on capital communication. So like the private sector, like in regards to the new urban agenda is inherently bad. Like you don't have to buy that like capitalism in itself is bad. Like that can be another debate for another round. But in terms of the resolution, in terms of how we're regarding like capitalism and the private sector in today's round, like the neg has shown that like it's inherently bad because it leads to the exacerbation of inequality, which if you vote AF, they then lose access to all of their solvency because of the finance structure. They tell you they're going to solve for like the internet, climate change, and like food insecurities. They can't solve for any of these things because they're limited by their financial structure and like the fact that it's like predicated on like this form of like capitalism. So if you're voting on if you're voting on the private sector, like the only way to vote for this is for the neg, because like if you vote AF, they're not going to see any of their impacts actually flow through in the real world because of like the finance structure. Finally, like the third biggest issue in today's round is going to be like food. So there's been this huge class over like subsistence farming versus like factory farming. Like logistically, subsistence farming is like farming for one's like own family. So as we start to see urbanization and growth, like it's not going to be like relied upon. You're going to see like this huge growth, and subsistence farming like isn't going to be enough to like feed all these people, which is how we get to like this logical jump of like factory farms. And this is problematic because A, like mitigates all of their like impacts of food. Like, and B, like even if you don't buy into that, you buy into substance farming, you still have to deal with like water quality. They completely drop this point when we bring it up under their climate change point. We tell you that urbanization contributes to climate change and that it also contributes to poor water quality. This was pretty much like agreed on during cross, and they never touched it in their rebuttal. So like it goes cold conceded if it wasn't brought up during cross. But the fact is, like, even if you do buy into this whole like subsistence farming point, like even if you don't want to make like that logical jump, then you're still left with the problem of like you can't farm like food for your family to eat if the water quality is poor, or if you do, it's going to be poor food. So like either way, like if you buy into the fact that like we're going to have factory farming, or if you don't and you're going to rely on subsistence farming, like you're still going to end up in the same place, and that's food insecurity. The new urban agenda doesn't solve for that either way. So at the end of the day, if you're voting for food security, you're voting for the negative team. For all of those reasons, we urge a neg ballot.
Good round.
Hey, let me know when y'all ready to talk. I don't want to be mindful of you all's time and everything, but and also give you plenty of time to ask questions. And okay, so y'all are good to go. That's what I'm talking about. Well, wonderful. Well, let me first start off by saying kudos to you. I'm glad I had an opportunity to be a part of an enjoyable and informative debate round. So you definitely met that bar and that expectation. So I want to applaud you. And unfortunately, that is not always the case when I watch a debate. That seems the whole truth. But so I definitely think all three of you are part of an activity that you should continue to be participating in. And I think all of your universities should be extremely proud that you are students at that institution. So I want to just give you kind of your pat on the back, your virtual flowers in this moment, just to let you know how much I appreciate the nature of this debate. It's real cordial, real pleasant to listen to. You don't get enough of people in cross-examination or crossfire, not only asking thoughtful questions, but also making thoughtful concessions and not just being difficult for the sake of being difficult. So there was much about this debate that I really enjoyed, and I just want to say kudos to you in that regard. But in the context of what y'all really want to know, who won and why did you vote, Mr. Rowland? Let me get to that. In this particular debate, I ended up voting affirmative for Florida State, and there were several reasons that I came to that conclusion. I do think that strategically, what was really challenging for the negative in this debate for Notre Dame was just the lack of having any type of alternative, having any type of counterplan or disadvantage or critique of some sort that you could have leveraged against the AF. I do think you do an amazing job of proving that the AF doesn't solve 100%. And I thought that you had some really persuasive case arguments. But in the context, but I do think the affirmative is spot on about in terms of the weighing mechanism for this debate. Not having any alternative means that all the impacts in this debate are inevitable. You never really prove why that's not the case. And I thought the strategicness of the 1AR was that he used your case arguments, which was the irony of this is that you started off the affirmative was, don't necessarily know how they're going to solve these things at first. And you all come in the negative, oh, they're really vague. But the team that decided ends up being most specific at the end of this debate is the affirmative. And so what happened in the 1AR that I thought was really crafty and strategic was really kind of just give specific ways in which they solve for the food security, specific ways for why they can address things like urbanization and then they put some defense against some of the arguments that you have as well. So at the end of the day, do I think that urban agenda solves everything? Probably not in the grandiose way that, in every pocket and every facet of the world, but in particular isolated areas, I'm convinced that it will make a difference. It will net on balance be better, and that they will do some things, especially in the short term as it relates to food security, give people the substance that they need in order to be able to eat. I don't have really a good answer to like the arguments like green belts, and even with this corporate argument, I think it gets a little messy in the sense that if corporations are funding or if they're building seems to be secondary to the fact that however, if they're funding or building, they're providing infrastructure that decreases poverty and provides a greater connection between rural and urban development. And if that happens, then that gives the AF access to their impacts that they talk about in terms of addressing food security. So I think if that is the argument that you want to go for, negative, you got to be a little bit clear about why does one over the other makes it inherently bad. I do think that that's probably the reason why the AF doesn't solve maybe 100% all over the world, but in the sense that corporations probably assert their agenda at some point. But in the short term, I don't have a reason why that will adversely prevent people from eating and solving for food security. And at the end of the day, also probably gives us access to some of the other impacts that the 1AC outlined. So I think you do a really good job of beating up the case, but not to the point where I still don't want to try to, it's kind of one of those try or die type environments where yes, the AF may not solve as well as it intended, but at the end of the day, there's no alternative. There's no other thing for me to try to address these harms that both sides have kind of admitted to. And if you want to win this particular debate, I think you have to articulate what is so unique about what the affirmative is putting forth that's going to make it uniquely worse. So that's why I say a counter plan, some alternative in this debate would have put you in a much stronger strategic position to win this debate, because I do think you're doing a really good job of attacking the case, especially coming out of the 1NC. So any questions, thoughts that I can try to answer for anybody?
I think we're good. We just kind of have been struggling to come up with some kind of offense, so it's good to know that we need that.
Yeah, I mean, let's think about that. I mean, you could. I think this would a critique would be very effective.
Right.
Because you can say, look, all the status quo is destined to fail. All these arguments for why urban agenda is going to be co-opted, why it spurs more urbanization. That provides you some uniqueness, and that even if it's just a basic like cap bad kind of critique, it can give you some leverage against the case.
Yeah, I mean, I
run this particular debate.
I run a cap K on the neg on the